I'll ask the question. You said you took down domestic violence by 64%. I'm interested to understand exactly how you did that. How did you stop men beating up women?
Okay. It was really about early intervention. What we did, I mean, I am a classic lawyer, I like empirical data, I like to see what works. So what I identified was that we had no common language. If you said, what is domestic violence, there was no definition. So all the different agencies were using a different definition. So one of the first things we did is to have one common definition. I'll give you an example. So let's suppose I am going to count, because I asked a very simple question when I first came in. I said, how many offences have we brought to justice? And nobody could answer. Why? Because we all counted things in a different way. The police counted how many people were arrested. The prosecutors counted how many people were charged. The court counted how many people were convicted. The probation service counted how many people were put on probation. And the prison counted how many people went to prison. Well, none of those figures correlated. So when you were trying to get end to end, it was impossible. I might say to you, I am counting glasses, okay, glasses. And you will say to me, you are counting glasses, but they're something you drink out of. So when we're looking at the facts, I'm talking spectacles, you're talking glasses, but we think we're speaking the same language. So the first thing we did was get a common definition of what was domestic violence. Then we looked generically at what was a high-risk case, what was a medium-risk case, and what was a low-risk case. Because the high-risk cases were the cases that might end up as grievous bodily harm or death. And so we looked to see what common features there were in those high-risk cases. Because we couldn't do all of them, but we needed to identify the high-risk cases so we could put a safety net. We then generically got all the agencies together to, once they'd got the same definition, once we had an agreement, and we asked them, what is a high-risk case for you? And in the event of a high-risk case, what would you do? And we were able to brigade all the characteristics which identified for them high risk and see the commonalities and pull those out and get an agreement. And we also were able to brigade all the things that people said they were obliged to do, either statutorily or by other means, to respond. So we were able to say, okay, so do we all agree this is high risk? Do we all agree that in the event of a high risk case, each of us, generically, will commit to do different things? Now, I'm housing, I'll rehouse you within 24 hours, I'm DWP, I'll give you benefits, I'm the school, I'm the health. So we now had a safety plan. The general conferencing of all of this would take 4 or 5 hours if you were having a multi-agency conference, because everyone would be talking, what do you mean? I don't know how to do that, I haven't got the services, and you have this great long conversation which used to end in very little happening. We changed that so that a multi-agency risk assessment could take place in 15 minutes. Because I'm not asking you, do you agree with me what high risk is? We've done it. I'm not begging you, will you find me a bed, or will you, because I already know you're going to do it. So all we're talking about is implementing the plan. And because we were able to operate this multi-agency risk assessment for those high-risk cases, we were able to identify them more quickly, intervene more effectively, and save more lives. So we weren't stopping men killing women or women killing men, but we were intervening earlier before they did. And we were able to train people. We trained everybody. If you walked, we trained you. We trained locksmiths, right? Because what happens when you break down the door, who goes in? The locksmith. So we trained locksmiths to see and understand domestic violence. So we looked at all the places people go. We trained teachers, we trained doctors, we trained nurses. And together, because we were able to recognise domestic violence, we were able to intervene earlier. And we spent, for every £1 we spent, we saved 6. Because we were able to work together. And instead of duplicating, we were able to support each other. It's a bit like all of us here going to a party, we're all invited to a wedding, and each of us have only got a tenner, right, for the present. We're going to spend £3.99 on the card, because they're really expensive now, and we're going to spend £2 on the wrapping paper. So we've each now got £4 to buy the present. And so this poor bride and groom are going to get a whole load of tact. Or we could say, let's buy 1 card, let's roll the boat up, we're going to spend a £5 on the card. And we're going to spend another £5 on the wrapping paper. But all of us are going to contribute together to the present. Now, we might only have to dip in £5, but we're going to get a fabulous present and save money. And that's basically what we did, is we worked together, in pulling people together in partnership. We were able to more effectively address the needs of the people who needed us to intervene. We were able to save money and help more people. So that's a really, you're really sorry you asked that question. But that's basically how we did it. Gentleman at the back, and then I'll take the gentleman at the front. I'll take 2 questions, one after the other.
Sorry, I was wondering if you could say a bit more about the causes of domestic violence, maybe it's like a common cause, I don't know, like alcoholism or virility or something like that.
Quite often it seems that domestic violence is a matter of control. Okay? It can be learned behaviour, and it can be, and it quite often starts in what appears to be a really innocuous way. It'll start by sometimes verbal aggression and control. So I'll give you an example. They have a partnership, they're going very well, and the partner now starts to criticise the woman. You know, I think you need to lose a bit of weight. And it starts as an undermining. Quite often if the person feels challenged. And after the verbal, it'll be someone tries to separate them from their support mechanism. So, I don't like your friends. You know, they're so loud. I really don't think you should associate with them. And as for your mother and your family, I really don't think you should be with them. And so gradually, the person is undermined, their sense of self is eroded, and when they are more softened to that, there will be quite often then physical abuse. Physical abuse doesn't come before verbal abuse. It's like verbal abuse, and after verbal abuse, physical abuse comes after. So firstly, there'll be a push, and people are always sorry. They're always really, really sorry, and they'll never do it again, and they only do it because the victim makes them. You know what upsets me. You know that I like my towels to be in a line. You know that I want my dinner on the table. You know that I don't like you speaking back to me in public and diminishing my sense of self. And gradually, that happens. And quite often it's about control. I want to control you. I feel that you are challenging me in too great a way. And after the verbal, then comes the physical. And usually it starts with a push. It was an accidental push. I didn't mean to push you. And then there is striking, and then after hitting with the hands and pushing, usually comes the kick, the punches, and it happens more rapidly. So there's usually a long period before incidents happens at the beginning, and gradually it becomes more and more repetitious, and it happens more and more. And that's why it's so important for people to recognise what's happening right at the beginning and to stop it, because it's actually very disruptive to the perpetrator too. Because if that pattern continues, they're likely to end up really hurting someone. And if you speak to people who've killed their partner, they've usually had a whole series of partners and broken relationships which have become more and more aggressive and more violent. Very few people go from nothing to killing someone. And it's watching out so that people identify the pattern in themselves, but also the pattern in others, and being able to see where it's going. And unfortunately, that pattern of control and dominance seems to be current all over the world. It's not something which seems to change. So recognising the nature of domestic violence and recognising that young people, what's quite tragic is lots of people think it only happens to older people, and yet those patterns are found in relationships between young people from the age of 12, 14, when the boyfriend or the girl starts to bully, intimidate, force. It's a quite complex thing, but there's a pattern that you can start recognising, and the good thing is you can do something about it. And so for the women in particular, I'm afraid, the first time someone says you're really fat and you need to change, get out of there. Don't hang around, okay? Not worth it. I'm out. So gentlemen, be very, very careful.
So you've actually answered my question. I had exactly the same question. But what would you propose in a perfect ideal world? What's the best thing to combat domestic violence at home?
I think it's to develop a very respectful and loving approach to each other, because if you nurture and support someone in a way that you would like to be treated, usually you get it about right. I didn't realise how lucky I was until I realised what other people lived with. So for instance, I believe that my father was one of the greatest feminists ever known to man, because he believed that women could do anything that men could do. But he'd whisper, "Oh, you better, darling." So I grew up believing that men were wonderful and could do anything in the world, but that women were wonderful too. And I never understood that there was a real difference between what women could do and what men could do. And I think if we are able, and we have to start early, to nurture our children, to understand that violence isn't an acceptable way to respond, I think we can go a long way. And I'll tell you a story of, in Montserrat, a very successful infant schools. It's never too early to start. We're doing a bit of domestic violence issues. So the children in the infant school were told about what hands were, the patty cake things. And they made up this little song that hands were for her, hands were for helping, hands were for holding, hands were for loving, hands were not for hurting. Okay, so one of those. And all the little kids did this, and hands are. And one day in a supermarket, there was a woman who was being quite aggressive to her child. It's actually a bit spooky what they did to these kids. Aggressive to her child and shouting at him. And from all over this supermarket, there came children. And they encircled this woman. And they started to hands off and of course she was stunned, thinking, oh my God, a bit like Alien. But it really worked. And these little ones had it, through this patter cake thing, had it in their heads that you don't use your hands to hurt other people. You don't use the hands to harm other people. You use them to help, to hold, to love, and to nurture. And you had all these little kids thinking, what's she doing? And I think we've got to really start early. And it's not accepting it. You know how none of us now think, I hope, that drinking and driving is cool. It's a total no-no, and people understand that if you drink and drive, that's a bad thing to do. I am as old as the ark, but when we started, people say, I drive better after 8 pints. Straight down the road. Now, that has been a cultural shift, and you'll quite often find young people saying to older people, you can't drive, you've had too much to drink. Because younger people now think it's culturally unacceptable. I think we need to do the same thing with domestic violence. So that quite often people get quite embarrassed when someone else is shouting at or abusing their partner. And this can happen in all relationships. It's not just heterosexual relationships it happens to. It happens into homosexual relationships too. It's no respect of anyone. I would love for us to have the confidence when you see that happening, just as you take someone's keys away, to say, you know what, that's not okay. It's really not okay for you to talk to that person that way. It's really inappropriate. I had Vernon Coker, who was a great friend, who's used to be a head teacher, was a minister with me, and Vernon's a real bloke, like a real bloke. And Vernon goes, that's bang out of order. That's bang out of order. And he says, that's bang out of order. And I want men to be able to say, because this isn't a feminist issue which is just about women feminists, not men feminists as well. I want us to have the confidence to say, it's bang out of order. And not to turn a blind eye if you see, one of your mates behaving aggressively to their girlfriend, to have the confidence to say, that's not okay. Because I think people are affected by what their peers do, and at the moment people get embarrassed and they don't want to hear, or they turn away, or they think, how do I respond to this? And so I think looking out for your friends, who may be victims, is really important, and talking about it. We had a CEO breakfast in the House of Lords. Many of the CEOs from the major companies came, 40 of them came, and there was one woman who was very affected by this issue. She said, but it hasn't happened to any of my friends, none of my friends. It hasn't happened to me. This is terrible. I just can't believe it. And she met her girlfriends, 6 of her girlfriends, every 2 months. They had a dinner. And she rang me and told me afterwards, and she went to them, and she was very struck by what had happened. So at this dinner she said, isn't it terrible? This is supposed to happen to 1 in 4 women all over our country. It's never happened to any of us. And there was silence. And she said, has it? And each of the other 5 said, it hasn't happened to you. And none of them, and they're really close friends, none of them had ever told each other. 4 of them, it had happened in the past, and 1 of them, it was happening to right then. She was in a very violent, abusive relationship. And she was a very, very senior woman who felt very uncomfortable about sharing that because she thought she would be diminished in other people's eyes. And she didn't have the confidence. And because none of her friends spoke about it, as if she wasn't given permission. And it was very interesting, wasn't it, people's reaction to the most recent domestic violence issue with Charles Saatchi. Because everyone thought the goddess, powerful, rich, Nigella beautiful, can't be happening to her, can it? And so I think the big lesson is to think it could be anybody, and that each of us has a role to play. And that's why I say we have more power than we think, because lots of people think, well, what can I do? Well, you can't change the world, say, by doing it at one bit at a time. It's like eating an elephant, you eat one tiny bit at a time. But we can all do our bit. We can do the people who are immediately around us. We can try and make the people we know and we care about safe. And one of the ways we make it safe is by giving us each permission to talk about it and making that space so people can feel comfortable about raising something that's really very difficult to talk about. And one of the things that I'm quite proud of is the fact that now, when domestic violence cases are reported, they are labelled by the media domestic violence, and more people in our country know what that means. Not everybody, but more people know what that means, and more people think it is unacceptable. So I would love to have a time when we will have no deaths in our country as a result of domestic violence. By the time I left in 2010, we had the lowest rate of crime since any time before 1981. And we reduced the first-time entrance into the criminal justice system, that's young people coming in, by 21%. And if you can keep young people out of the criminal justice system until they are 16, the likelihood is they will never get into it. So cutting off the legs of it is really important. And when you're looking at perpetrators, the majority of people who suffer from domestic violence and live in domestic violence homes never, ever, ever, ever go on to abuse. However, of those who do, more than 95% of them have suffered domestic violence, either directly or indirectly through witnessing it as a child. So it is a very damaging and destructive thing, and it is in part learned patterns of behaviour. I remember talking to an earl who will remain nameless. He's now no longer with us, so it's a very current earl. It's now, unfortunately, a deceased earl. And I was talking to him about domestic violence. Actually, I don't think that happens very much now. Anyway, I said my dad, I suppose he didn't bash my mother up out of it. So there is, it's not a class thing, it's not a cultural thing. It can be a duchess or a dustman, wife of a dustman, and it could still happen to you. And we can change that if we choose. I really think we should choose. I hope all of you will choose. Yeah.
I wonder if in your experience of developing a framework for high-risk cases, whether you found ways of better quantifying and targeting the sort of psychosocial leading and the stigma that you talked about.
Most victims I spoke to thought it was all their fault, that they had created this, because quite often their partner appeared lovely to everyone else. And one of the things that they'd be told is no one will believe you, because I'm so nice. And if this happens, not only will you believe, but I will take your children away. So breaking that cycle of abuse was very important, but you had to break the silence, because we've come a long way in the last years from it being a taboo subject which happened behind closed doors, which no one spoke about, to it no longer being taboo and it being an okay thing to admit. And if you think about how difficult it is for men to admit if they are being abused, you know, because everyone thinks you're a wuss if your wife is terrorising you. So it's quite difficult. So breaking down those barriers are really important, and having many more people do the empirical data. It's been very, very important. It's very important for us when I was trying to argue for the resources and for realignment, for us to have Sylvia Warby's research, which disaggregated the parts which contributed to it. And I was then able to use that empirical data to argue for change of policy. And in 2009, I don't know why, but I thought there might be, December 2009, I thought there might be some possibility that the Labour government would not come back. I don't know why. I just thought that might be a possibility. So one of the things we did is we asked, and lots of people said you shouldn't do this because why produce data which might show you've been a total wombat. But I wanted Sylvia to go back in to quantify what we've done. Had we made a change? Had it made any difference? And if so, how? And I wanted her to use the same test so that it couldn't be said that we'd rejigged it or we'd somehow stacked the odds in one favour of another. And she came, and it was she who came back and said that was the amount we had reduced it by. So And no one has been able to undermine the methodology, because what we'd said to her in the beginning is because nobody really trusts statistics. You know, people always say you can make statistics say whatever you want them to say. So we had said, make it bulletproof. If there's anything which is vaguely arguable, bin it. So it can be 50 times more, but it cannot be a penny less than the amount you come up with. So she used the same data set and the same approach, and we got that empirical data. So there is a lot more to do, and had we stayed, I think we would be doing a lot more. But the difference is, I think we were doing it holistically, and the current government has kept some of the things. They've kept the multi-agency risk assessment, they've kept the independent domestic violence advisors, but they haven't kept all of it, and that's why it's all disintegrating, because silo-based working really doesn't work, and that's what we discovered. So it is challenging. We also introduced something called the intervention treatment programs, which was using the same methodology holistically to deal with multi-dysfunctional families. And we found a massive improvement. Some of these families who were spending between £250,000 and £350,000 each, and we were able to reduce domestic violence in those families by 89%, and antisocial behaviour went down, a number of the other factors was improved, and we were only spending, because we were doing it holistically, about £8,000 or £9,000. And the government has sort of continued that. They've renamed it, which I'm very happy to. They renamed it, but they're continuing. In fact, when I left government, I was saying to everybody, I don't care if you paint this blue and call it Cameron's Delight. I'm happy. Just continue doing it. And they haven't quite done that, but I'm still hopeful that we'll come back to some of it in the longer term.
Can we take the last few questions, Nancy? The last.
Okay.
And
Should we
everyone
take-
puts their hands up.
Should we take the 4 questions one all together, then I'll answer them at the end? Okay, so keep your, so one,
Yeah.
this one first.
It's not quite clear to me, does it include violence to children, or is it violence to partners, men or women?
It's domestic violence. When we were talking about the 49 figures, we were talking about partner violence. But that's why it's really important to include the 750,000 children who are adversely affected as secondary participants. So what we've done is, so for instance, in the policies, we were saying when the police go in, if there's a domestic violence case, you have to look for the children.
But is it violence towards children, is that included?
That it is included. It's included in the concept of domestic violence, but really, when I was talking earlier, we were talking about partner violence. So domestic violence has an impact on children, and we look at the impact on children, but the partner violence is usually where it springs from, and the children are secondary victims of the violence. Sometimes the violence is directly at children, and that, of course, then becomes included in child abuse, which is physical or emotional. But when you're looking at the impact, we were including the impact on children as a very important and essential thing for us to cover, because you can't look at it as separate. So partner violence is what you count, but you look at the impact of that partner violence on the children within the family. That's the next. Will you next? Yeah, and then we'll continue.
You touched on it briefly in your previous answer, but I was wondering, did you have a similar success rate in reducing violence against men as you did women, and did you approach violence against men in a different way?
We approached violence against domestic violence generically, irrespective of gender. But 89% of the repeat victims, that's victims who were affected by domestic violence 3 or more times, were women. So there was a disproportionate benefit to women because they were overrepresented in the population of the stats. So the 64% was a reduction of domestic violence generally. But it was disproportionately beneficial to women because 89% of the repeat victims were women. So that's how it worked out.
So saying in what the new strategy seems to be is looking at women to look at the actual men, i.e. the abusers of a woman who's abusive, and have almost like you would with like narcotics or
a good resource, and there are a number of groups, and I'm wearing the sort of the male, because it's the White Ribbon Alliance is Men Against Violence, and we had something called the Respect Campaign, and there are organisations which really help men who identify themselves as being at risk of being abusers or being abusers who want to stop. But when we were looking at resources, because 89% of the victims are women, the concentration was on helping to stop that flow. But there was a very strong argument, and it was put to me by a perpetrator who said, look, I've been beating and abusing women, who is now 39, since I was 14. And he'd only been in a non-abusive relationship for the first time for 9 months. And he said, you would have been much better off stopping me than all the victims I have. It's like a butterfly going from polluting as opposed to pollinating as they go. And that is a very strong thing. And we were looking at perpetrators, we were looking at programs. But the pressing need, of course, with refuge and everything else, was trying to stem the flow of the victims, but also it's really beneficial for men, if they were abusers, or any abuser, because a woman can be an abuser, if you can stop them early, before they have really continued on that path of abuse, which is so dreadful. So getting in early is a really good way of stopping the men as well as helping the victims. There was one person at the back, wasn't there? Yeah.
I was just wondering, because we were talking about how important it is to talk about domestic violence or domestic abuse. And, you know, in the academic sector at least, it seems that domestic violence is a big issue. Like, for instance, in Norway, there are lots of books about domestic violence. And it is very much talked about violence by male perpetrators against their female spouses. Also, the other way around is acknowledged. Domestic violence in homosexual relationships is, let's say, mentioned, but for instance, domestic violence in transsexual relationships, there's absolutely nothing. So I was wondering, do you have any experiences or statistics that concern domestic violence in transsexual relationships?
Well, the thing that we have identified is that it's no respect of persons, period. So if it's male, the violence we're talking about, 1 in 6 men and 1 in 4 women, it could be a transgender, a homosexual relationship. I mean, some of the relationships that we're talking 1 in 6 men could be men on men, could be a transgender person. So the thing that we have discovered, which is really sad, is that domestic violence it's like an epidemic. It doesn't differentiate between peoples or sexual orientation. And I think the thing that we've all got to get into our heads is it could be anyone. It's not as if you can say, well, it's a transgender issue, or it's a homosexual issue, or it's only a heterosexual issue, or it's an issue that affects you only if you're over 25, but doesn't affect you if you're 12. It's just not true. You know, it's something which happens in relationships, no matter the nature of the sexual orientation or nature of that relationship. And that's what's quite scary about it, but also in one sense, that's what's quite good about it, because it's got the same DNA, and you can therefore seek to address it in a similar way, whoever those people happen to be, sensitive to the differences, but actually the methodology, the genesis, the way it represents itself and manifests itself tends to be similar.
And to round it up there, but thank you so much, and thanks once again to Baroness.